For nearly 100 years, one military formation terrorized Europe. They called it the Tercio, a walking fortress of 3,000 men, pikes bristling outward like the spines of some massive beast, musketeers guarding each corner like turrets on a castle. Armies saw it coming and broke before contact. Cavalry charges dissolved against it. Commanders who faced it had two choices: retreat or die. The Spanish perfected it. Then they used it to dominate a continent, and nobody could figure out how to beat it. Until a 36-year-old Swedish king stepped onto a battlefield in Saxony with an army half the size of his enemies and shattered a century of military thinking. In a single afternoon. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, and what he did at Breitenfield in 1631 would earn him a title that still stands almost 400 years later: the father of modern warfare. But here's the thing, he didn't just win a battle, he reinvented how wars are fought. To understand why Gustavus Adolphus matters, you first need to understand what he was up against. And what he was up against had been crushing armies for a century. The Tercio, picture this: 3,000 soldiers packed into a giant rectangular block. At the center, pikemen carrying 18-foot spears. On the corners and edges, musketeers ready to unleash volleys of gunfire. Contemporary observers described them as iron cornfields. Others called them walking citadels, mobile castles with 4 turrets. And that's exactly what they were. If cavalry charged, they'd meet a wall of pike points. Horses won't run into that. They'll stop, they'll panic. And while they're panicking, the musketeers are reloading and firing again. If infantry attacked, they'd face the same problem. You can't break through a formation that dense. It's like trying to punch through a wall of human beings, all stabbing outward. The Spanish perfected this system under a commander named Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba. They called him El Gran Capitan. In 1503, at the Battle of Caranola, Córdoba put his new system to the test. He faced a French army backed by Swiss mercenaries, the most feared infantry in Europe at the time. The Swiss had their own pike formations. They were disciplined, brutal, confident. Córdoba dug a ditch in front of his lines and waited. When the Swiss charged, the ditch broke their rhythm. Their tight formation became ragged, and as they stumbled forward, Spanish arquebusiers opened fire. The volleys were devastating. And once the enemy lines fell into chaos, Córdoba sent his tercios forward. Pikemen pushing, musketeers firing, cavalry chasing down anyone who ran. The French were annihilated, their artillery captured. Naples fell within weeks. And just like that, a new era of warfare began. Now, here's what makes this terrifying from a military perspective. The Tercio wasn't just a formation. It was a system. A system built on Spanish discipline. Professional soldiers who trained together, fought together, knew exactly when to fire, when to hold, when to advance. You couldn't just copy it. Plenty tried. Most failed. For the next 100 years, the Turco dominated European battlefields. At Pavia, in 1525, they destroyed the French again and captured King Francis I himself. Think about that for a moment. They captured a king. After that, most armies didn't even want to fight them. Commanders would avoid battle entirely rather than face a Tercio head-on. And honestly, I can't blame them. What do you even do against a formation like that? It's slow. Sure, it's heavy, but it doesn't need to be fast. It just needs to keep moving forward, and when it reaches you, you're finished. But here's the thing about dominant systems. They create blind spots. When something works for a century, people stop questioning it. They stop innovating. They assume the answer has already been found. The Tercio was so successful that military thinking across Europe became frozen around it. Every army either used Tercios or tried to counter Tercios with their own version. Nobody asked, what if the whole concept is flawed? Nobody except a young Swedish king who inherited a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Now, let's talk about Gustavus Adolphus, because on paper, he had no business changing anything. When he became king in 1611, he was 16 years old, not even technically an adult. The Swedish estates only let him take full power in exchange for major political concessions. And the situation he inherited absolute chaos. His father, Charles IX, had made enemies everywhere. He'd seized the throne from his own nephew, Sigismund III, who was also King of Poland. That created a dynastic war that would drag on for 60 years. Charles had also started a war with Russia, trying to put his younger son on the Russian throne. And then, while Swedish armies were stuck in Russia, he picked a fight with Denmark too. 3 wars simultaneously against major powers. Let me say that again. Sweden was fighting Denmark, Poland, and Russia at the same time. Charles IX died and left this mess to his teenage son. Oh, and the Swedish people, they hated the monarchy. Charles had been a brutal, arbitrary ruler. He'd executed 5 members of the high aristocracy. He'd clashed with the Lutheran Church. The country was exhausted and broke. So when Gustavus Adolphus took the throne, nobody was expecting a future legend. They were expecting damage control. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of collapsing, Gustavus started solving problems. He made peace with Denmark. He pushed back the Russians. He contained the Polish threat. Step by step, he stabilized Sweden. And while he was doing that, he was also rebuilding the Swedish military from the ground up. See, Gustavus wasn't just a king. He was a student of war. He studied what the Dutch commander Maurice of Nassau had been experimenting with. Wool and palla, smaller units, better drill, more firepower. And then he took those ideas further than anyone else. He didn't just want to match the Tercio, he wanted to break it. Before we talk about what Gustavus Adolphus did, we need to talk about who he was, because his innovations didn't come from nowhere. They came from a specific kind of mind, a specific kind of personality. And honestly, the more I researched this guy, the more fascinating he became. He was terrifyingly educated. Gustavus wasn't just a warrior king. He was a scholar. By the time he was a teenager, he spoke fluent Swedish, German, Dutch, French, Italian, and Latin. He could read Greek. He studied history, theology, mathematics, and law. This wasn't normal for monarchs at this time. Most kings knew how to fight and how to rule. They didn't spend hours reading classical military texts. But Gustavus devoured knowledge. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great. He read about Roman legions. He examined what Maurice of Nassau was doing with the Dutch army. And here's the key. He didn't just read passively. He questioned. He asked, why does this work? Why did this fail? What could be done differently? That questioning mindset is titans. What separated him from other commanders? Most generals learned tactics the way they learned religion, as received wisdom, not to be questioned. The Tercio worked because it had always worked. End of discussion. Gustavus looked at the Tercio and saw problems to be solved. He led from the front, literally. This is something that can't be overstated. Gustavus Adolphus did not command from a safe hill behind his lines. He did not send orders through messengers while sipping wine in a tent. He was in the battle, in the mud, in the blood, taking the same risks as his lowest soldier. At Breitenfield, he personally led cavalry charges. At other battles, he was seen rallying broken units, grabbing flags, pushing forward alongside infantry. Men, he was wounded multiple times throughout his career. Shot, cut, bruised. He kept fighting. And here's what that does for an army. When soldiers see their king charging beside them, not behind them, something changes. Morale becomes almost religious. Men will do things they would never do for a distant commander. They'll hold when they should break. They'll charge when retreat makes more sense. They'll die before they let their king down. Gustavus understood this instinctively, but it came with a cost. That same willingness to lead from the front would eventually kill him. He knew his men. There are accounts of Gustavus walking through camp at night, talking to soldiers, learning their names, asking about their families. For a king in the 17th century, this was almost unheard of. Monarchs were supposed to be distant, elevated, divine figures who existed above common men. Gustavus rejected that. He ate with his officers. He shared hardships on campaign. When supplies ran low, he went hungry alongside everyone else, and the army loved him for it. One Swedish soldier later wrote that serving under Gustavus felt like following a father. Demanding, yes. Expecting the impossible sometimes, but always there, always present, always sharing the danger. That kind of loyalty can't be purchased. It has to be earned, and Gustavus earned it every single day. He was also ruthless. Let's not romanticize this too much. Gustavus Adolphus was a 17th century warlord. He did what warlords do. His armies plundered. They requisitioned food and supplies from local populations. They made war support war. A polite way of saying they took what they needed and left civilians with nothing. He rewarded his generals by giving them conquered lands. He treated some German princes as feudal subordinates, demanding obedience in exchange for protection. And he was ambitious, deeply, possibly dangerously ambitious. Some historians believe he was working toward becoming Holy Roman Emperor himself. Others think he wanted permanent Swedish dominance over Northern Europe. The truth is probably complicated. But what's clear is that Gustavus didn't enter the 30 Years' War out of pure religious devotion. He saw opportunity. He saw a chance to make Sweden great, and he took it. Does that diminish his achievements? I don't think so. History is full of great men who were also flawed men. Gustavus was both a military genius and a ruthless opportunist. He could inspire fanatical loyalty and also demand absolute obedience. That complexity makes him more interesting, not less. He thought differently about war. Here's what really set Gustavus apart from his contemporaries. Most commanders in this era thought about battles. They thought about formations. They thought about winning the fight directly in front of them. Gustavus thought about campaigns. He thought about supply lines, about logistics, about how to keep an army fed and equipped across months of fighting. He thought about strategic objectives. Not just defeat the enemy army, but control this region, secure this river crossing, deny the enemy this resource. He thought about what we would now call combined arms at the operational level. How to coordinate cavalry, infantry, and artillery. Not just in a single battle, but across an entire theater of war. This was new, and it's why his impact lasted so long. He wasn't just teaching generals how to fight a battle. He was teaching them how to think about war itself. One more thing about Gustavus. He knew he might not survive. In letters to his wife, Maria Eleonora, and 2 Swedish officials, he wrote about the possibility of his death with remarkable calm. He made provisions. He gave instructions for how Sweden should continue if he fell. Some historians interpret this as fatalism. Others see it as simple realism. He was a battlefield commander who took enormous personal risks. But I think there's something else there, too. I think Gustavus understood that what he was building was bigger than himself. The army, the tactics, the ideas, these would outlast him, and they did. When he died at Luton, the Swedish war machine kept functioning. His generals applied his methods. His system survived. That's the mark of a true leader. Not just personal brilliance, but creating something that works without you. Gustavus did that. So what exactly did Gustavus Adolphus change everything? Let's break it down. First, he made formations smaller and wider. The Tercio was deep. 50. 260 ranks of men stacked behind each other. Powerful, yes, but most of those soldiers couldn't actually fight. Only the front ranks could use their weapons. Everyone else was just pushing. Gustavus flattened his formations. Instead of 50 ranks, he used 6, sometimes less. This meant more soldiers could actually fire at the same time. Instead of a deep block with limited firepower, he created long, thin lines that could unleash devastating volleys. And here's the human element. Imagine being a soldier in a tercio, watching a Swedish line. Open fire. You're packed tight. You can't move. Every shot hits someone. It's not a battle. It's a massacre. Second, he solved the cavalry problem. At this time, cavalry had become almost useless against infantry formations. Horses won't charge into pikes. So, cavalrymen had adopted a tactic called the caracal. Ride up, fire a pistol, then wheel away to reload. It looked impressive. It achieved almost nothing. Gustavus threw that out. He trained his cavalry to charge with swords. Actually, close with the enemy. Use speed and shock to break formations before they could react. But, and this is important, he didn't send cavalry in alone. He mixed musketeers directly into the cavalry formations. So, while the horsemen charged, infantry was firing in support. Nobody had combined arms like this before. Third, he revolutionized artillery. Cannons at this time were heavy, massive. They'd be positioned before battle and basically stay there. You'd fire them, but you couldn't really move them. Gustavus created light artillery. We're naive. Small enough that 2 men or a single horse could reposition them during battle. These guns could follow the infantry, advance with the attack, provide fire support exactly where it was needed. One source described his standard field gun as weighing only 500 pounds. Previous cannons weighed several thousand. This wasn't just an improvement. This was a complete rethinking of what artillery could do. Fourth, he made everything work together. And this is the real genius. Lots of commanders had good cavalry or good infantry or decent cannons. Gustavus had all three working as a single system. His infantry would advance in those thin, firepower-heavy lines. Artillery would move with them, softening enemy positions. Cavalry would wait for the right moment, then crash into weakened formations. Each piece supported the others. No single element had to win alone. The Tercio was a fortress. Gustavus built a machine. Now, here's my take on why this matters so much. Military history is full of clever innovations. New weapons, new formations, tricks that work once. But what Gustavus created wasn't a trick. It was a philosophy. The idea that an army should be flexible, that units should support each other, that firepower, mobility, and shock should work together. That philosophy is still the foundation of modern armies today. When you see a combined arms assault in a documentary about modern warfare, tanks, infantry, air support, all coordinating, you're seeing Gustavus' thinking evolved over 4 centuries. He didn't just win battles, change the logic of how battles are fought. But in 1631, all of this was still theory. Gustavus had built his new army. He trained it. He believed in it. Now he needed to prove it worked. And the test was coming. Let's set the scene properly. September 1631. The 30 Years' War has been raging for 13 years. Germany is bleeding. Protestant cities have been sacked. Magdy, one of the wealthiest cities in the Holy Roman Empire, was captured by imperial forces just months earlier. The sack was so brutal, so complete, that Magdeburg became a verb, meaning total destruction. Tens of thousands dead. The city burned. Women and children slaughtered. This is the context. Gustavus Adolphus has been in Germany for over a year, but he's struggled to find allies. The Protestant princes don't trust him. They resent Swedish interference. They remember that Gustavus is a foreign king with his own agenda. But Magdi changed things. Suddenly, neutrality looked suicidal. And when imperial forces violated Saxon territory, John George of Saxony finally allied with Sweden. Gustavus had an army large enough to face the Catholics in open battle. The question was, could his new system actually work? Johann Surlis, Count of Tilly, commanded the Imperial Catholic League forces. Tilly was 72 years old. He'd been fighting for decades. He'd never lost a major battle. His nickname was the Monk in Armor because of his austere lifestyle and religious devotion. He was also a true believer in the Tercio system. His army was built around it. His veterans knew it. It had never failed him. Tilly had approximately 35,000 men. The corps was veteran imperial infantry organized in massive tercio blocks. His cavalry was experienced. His artillery was substantial, though heavy and hard to move. Against him, Gustavus with about 23,000 Swedish troops and John George with roughly 18,000 Saxons. Combined, the Protestant forces slightly outnumbered the Catholics, but numbers don't tell the whole story. The Saxons were inexperienced. Many had never seen real combat. Their loyalty was questionable. John George was an opportunist who might switch sides if things went badly. Gustavus knew this. He positioned the Saxons on the left wing away from where he expected the heaviest fighting. He was wrong. The terrain around Breitenfield was relatively flat. Open fields, some gentle slopes, good ground for cavalry, and for the kind of linear formations Gustavus preferred. The morning of September 17th was clear. The two armies formed up, facing each other across the plain. Tilly positioned his tercios in the center, massive blocks of pikemen and musketeers, infantry that had crushed armies across Europe. On his left-wing cavalry under Pappenheim, one of the most aggressive commanders in the imperial army. On his right wing, more cavalry supporting the infantry, artillery positioned forward. It was a classic formation, proven deadly. Gustavus arranged his forces differently. His Swedish infantry formed in the center, but in those shallow, linear formations, 6 ranks deep instead of 50. More men could fire, more firepower per yard. Up front, he interspersed his infantry with small groups of light artillery. Those revolutionary lightweight guns that could actually move during battle on his right wing. Swedish cavalry under himself and other commanders. Crucially, musketeers were mixed directly into the cavalry formations for combined arms effect. On his left wing, the Saxons under John George, a gamble behind everything. A reserve, fresh units that could reinforce wherever needed. This reserve is often overlooked, but it was critical. Most armies committed everything to the initial formation. Gustavus held forces back precisely because he expected things to go wrong. Smart and soon to be proven essential. Around noon, artillery opened. Fire. The exchange lasted about 2 hours. Cannonballs tearing through formations. Men dying before the real fighting even started. Gustavus' light artillery had an advantage here. Faster rate of fire, easier to adjust aim. Till's heavier guns did. Serious damage, too. Then Pappenheim got impatient. Against Till's orders, Pappenheim launched his cavalry against the Swedish right wing. He charged 7 times. 7 times, each time the Swedish cavalry and interspersed musketeers threw him back. The combined arm system worked exactly as designed. Horsemen couldn't break through when they were being shot at by infantry mixed into the enemy formation. Pappenheim's cavalry was being ground down, but he kept attacking, convinced that one more charge would break the Swedes. It didn't. While Pappenheim was throwing himself against the Swedish right, Tilly saw an opportunity. The Saxons on the Protestant left looked weak, inexperienced, nervous. He sent his cavalry against them, and the Saxons broke. It wasn't a fighting retreat. It wasn't an ordered withdrawal. They shattered. John George himself fled the battlefield. Thousands of Saxon soldiers ran north, pursued by imperial cavalry. Within minutes, the entire Protestant left wing ceased to exist. Now, here's where most battles would end. Tilly had destroyed half the enemy army. His cavalry was behind the Protestant lines. The Swedish left flank was completely exposed. In any normal battle, this is when the other side collapses. Panic spreads. Units realize they're about to be surrounded. Everyone runs. That didn't happen. This is the moment that proved Gustavus' system. As the Saxons ran, Gustavus didn't panic, adapted. He ordered units from his reserve to swing left and form a new flank. His formation pivoted, bending to face the new threat. His light artillery repositioned, impossible for the heavy imperial guns, and began firing into the cavalry, trying to exploit the gap. Some Swedish infantry units literally turned 90 in the middle of battle to face the flanking attack. Think about how hard this is. Smoke everywhere. Noise so loud you can't hear orders. Men dying around you, and you're being asked to completely change facing. To trust that the men beside you are doing the same thing to maintain formation discipline in absolute chaos. The Tercios couldn't do this. They were too big, too rigid. Once they were facing one direction, that was it. Gustavus. Smaller, more flexible units could actually maneuver, and they did. The Swedish army bent, but didn't break. While the left wing was stabilizing, Gustavus launched his decisive stroke. His right-wing cavalry, the same units that had repelled Pappenheim 7 times, now went on the offensive. They smashed into Till's left-wing cavalry and broke them. Then, they wheeled. Instead of pursuing the fleeing horsemen, which is what cavalry usually did, chasing broken enemies was more profitable than continuing to fight. Gustavus' cavalry turned and attacked the imperial infantry from the side. At the same time, Swedish infantry advanced from the front and Swedish artillery kept repositioning, kept firing, pouring shot into the Tercio blocks. The Tercios were designed to face forward. They were fortresses with one gate. Now they were being hit from 2 directions at once, and they started to die. Here's what it looked like from inside an imperial tercio. At this moment, you're packed tight with 3,000 other men. You've been standing here for hours. Artillery has been killing your friends. The smoke is so thick you can barely see. Then Swedish cavalry hits your flank. You try to turn, but you can't. The formation is too dense. The men beside you are in the way. Pikes get tangled. Musketeers can't reload because there's no room to move. And from the front, Swedish infantry is advancing. Their formation is shallow. Every man can fire. Volleys smashing into your packed ranks. Where do the muskballs go when they hit a formation? 50 ranks deep. They go through multiple people. Men are falling, screaming. The formation starts to buckle. Someone in the middle breaks and tries to run. That creates a gap. The cavalry pours through. Now, it's not a battle, it's a slaughter. By late afternoon, Till's army was destroyed. The Tercios that had terrorized Europe for a century were shattered across the fields of Breitenfield. 7,000 imperial soldiers lay dead. Another 6,000 were captured. The artillery train was taken. Tilly himself was wounded and nearly captured. He escaped with a small escort, fleeing the worst defeat of his career. Swedish casualties approximately 1,200 killed and wounded. The disparity is staggering. Why? It worked. Let me break down exactly why Gustavus won this battle. Flexibility. When the Saxons broke his army, adapted. The Tercio couldn't have done this. Combined arms, cavalry, and musketeers. Working together neutralized Pappenheim's charges. Artillery moved with infantry. Everything supported everything else. Firepower concentration. Shallow formations meant more guns firing. Tercio depth meant wasted manpower. Leadership. Gustavus was personally directing the battle, making decisions in real time. Tilly was commanding a system designed to work on its own. But when the system failed, he had no backup. The reserve. Those held back units saved the left flank. Tilly had committed everything from the start. This wasn't luck. This was a better system defeating an outdated one. And every military mind in Europe understood what it meant. The news spread across the continent like fire. The invincible Tercio had been broken. Tilly, the undefeated, was defeated. A Swedish king with a strange new army had humiliated the greatest military power in Europe. Protestant leaders rejoiced. Catholics panicked. Governments scrambled to understand what had happened. Within months, Gustavus was the most famous man in Europe, the Lion of the North, savior of Protestantism. Some called him a new Alexander, and his ideas spread even faster than his fame. Other armies started copying his formations, his artillery designs, his cavalry tactics. The Tercio didn't disappear immediately. Change takes time, but its dominance was finished. Breitenfeld wasn't just a battle. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. So why does Gustavus Adolphus deserve that title? It's not just because he won at Breitenfeld. Lots of generals win battles. It's because of what his victory represented. He proved that flexibility beats rigidity, that combined arms beat isolated formations, that mobility and firepower together are more powerful than mass alone. And every army in Europe was watching. After Breitenfeld, Gustavus swept through Germany like a storm. By Christmas 1631, he'd established himself at Mainz. Protestant hopes soared. The entire balance of the 30 Years' War shifted. He wasn't just winning, he was rewriting the rules. His system spread. Other armies started adopting his ideas. Smaller formations, mobile artillery, cavalry that actually charged. The Turo didn't disappear overnight, but its dominance was broken. The future belonged to a new way of war. The reaction across Europe tells you everything. Cardinal Richelieu, the brilliant French minister, called Gustavus the Golden King and the most accomplished commander of the age. A Jesuit priest who witnessed the aftermath wrote with something like horror. The Swedish king has introduced a new art of war. His soldiers fight not as men, but as a single terrible machine. Their muskets speak together. Their cavalry strikes as one fist. We have seen nothing like this before. That phrase, a single terrible machine, captures it perfectly. Tilly himself, the defeated imperial general, wrote to the emperor, "We fought according to the rules of war as we have always known them. The Swede fights by different rules. His formations bend but do not break. His guns move as if alive. His cavalry charges with a fury we cannot match. I do not understand how he does this." The key phrase, I do not understand how he does this. Tilly was a veteran of decades of warfare. He'd won battle after battle, and he genuinely could not comprehend what Gustavus had done. That's how revolutionary the Swedish system was. Gustavus himself understood what he was building. Before entering the war, he told the Swedish parliament, "The danger is great. I do not deny it. The enemy is strong, but if we wait until the fire reaches our own shores, we will fight alone and in ruins. Better to meet the enemy far from home, with allies while we still have strength." This is strategic thinking at its clearest. Forward defense. Meet threats before they reach you. He also reportedly said, "An army of deer led by a lion is more to be feared than an army of lions led by a deer." Whether he actually said this or it was attributed to him later, it reflects how people understood his impact. Leadership matters more than raw material. But here's the tragedy. Gustavus never saw the full impact of what he'd created. On November 6, 1632, at the Battle of Luton, he led a cavalry charge into heavy fog and enemy fire. The morning was dark. Mist covered the field. Visibility was terrible. Gustavus rode forward with his cavalry, trying to personally lead a breakthrough against the imperial left wing. He got separated from his escort. He was hit in the arm, then shot in the back. His horse carried him forward into enemy lines. Imperial soldiers surrounded him. They didn't recognize him at first. They shot him again in the head. He was 37 years old. When Swedish soldiers recovered his body, it had been stripped by Luthers. His armor, his clothes, everything valuable gone. But they recognized their king. Accounts describe hardened veterans weeping openly. Officers who had followed him for years, unable to speak. The Lion of the North was dead. So what did Gustavus Adolphus actually leave behind? Let's count it up. He transformed Sweden from a poor, isolated northern kingdom into a major European power. He shattered the dominance of the Tercio and replaced it with a new way of war. He introduced combined arms tactics that would influence military thinking for centuries. He proved that innovation and flexibility could defeat tradition and mass. And he died at the height of his power, leading from the front like he always had. Historians still debate his motives. Was he a Protestant hero, a political opportunist, an economic imperialist chasing Baltic trade? Maybe all three, maybe none. But one thing isn't debatable. He earned his title, the father of modern warfare. Gustavus Adolphus died on November 6, 1632. He was 37 years old at the height of his power, leading a cavalry charge into fog and musket fire. His body was found. After the battle, stripped by Luthers who didn't recognize the dead man they were robbing. When Swedish soldiers recovered him and realized what had happened, the grief was overwhelming. The Lion of the North was dead. But what happened next? Here's the remarkable thing. Sweden didn't collapse. Gustavus had built his system well enough that it functioned without him. His chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, took over political leadership. Oxen was brilliant in his own right. One of the finest statesmen of the era. He had worked alongside Gustavus for years and understood both the king's vision and the practical realities of Swedish power. Military command passed to a succession of capable generals who had learned their trade under Gustavus. Men like Johan Bonneri, Leonard Torstensson, and Carl Gustaf Engel. These commanders applied Gustavian principles for the remaining 16 years of the 30 Years' War, and Sweden kept winning. The 30 Years' War dragged on until 1648, 16 more years of fighting after Gustavus' death. Germany was devastated. Some regions lost half their population to war, famine, and disease. It was one of the most destructive conflicts in European history before the 20th century. Swedish armies remained in the field throughout. They fought major battles. They won most of them. They applied the combined arms tactics and flexible formations that Gustavus had pioneered. But something was different. Without Gustavus' personal charisma and leadership, the Swedish cause lost its messianic energy. The war became more cynical, more about territorial gain than Protestant liberation. Sweden's generals were competent. Some were excellent. But none of them had that spark that made men believe they were fighting for something transcendent. Gustavus had been a cause as much as a commander. Without him, Sweden was just another power competing for advantage. In 1648, the war finally ended with the Peace of Westphalia. Sweden emerged as one of the great winners. The treaties gave Sweden control of significant German territories, parts of Pomerania, Bremen, Verdun, and other lands along the Baltic. Coast Sweden now controlled the mouths of major German rivers. It collected tolls on trade. It had become a genuine European great power. This was Gustavus' legacy made permanent. A small, poor northern kingdom had transformed into a major player. In European politics, Swedish kings would sit at the table with French kings and Habsburg emperors as equals. None of this would have been possible without what Gustavus achieved in his brief 2 years of campaigning in Germany. For the next 60 years, Sweden dominated the Baltic region. Historians call this period the Swedish Empire, or the Age of Greatness. Storm Axe Titan in Swedish. Swedish armies fought in Poland, Denmark, Russia, and across Germany. Swedish diplomats negotiated from a position of strength. Swedish culture flourished. All of this was built on the foundation Gustavus had laid. His military reforms remained the core of Swedish power. His administrative innovations strengthened the state. His reputation gave Sweden prestige far beyond what its population and economy would normally justify. Gustavus left behind one heir, his daughter Christina. She was 6 years old when he died. Christina would become one of the most fascinating monarchs in European history. Yamul, brilliant, eccentric, eventually converting to Catholicism and abdicating the throne in a scandal that shocked Protestant Europe. But during her minority and early reign, Oxenstierre and the Swedish Council continued Gustavus' policies. The system held together. That's a testament to what Gustavus built. It wasn't dependent on him personally, it was institutional. It survived his death and even survived the complications of a child monarch. But empires don't last forever. In 1697, another teenage king took the Swedish throne. Charles IX. Charles was brave to the point of recklessness, a military genius. In many ways, he won stunning victories against Russia, Poland, and Denmark. But he lacked Gustavus' political wisdom. He couldn't turn military success into lasting strategic advantage. He kept fighting when he should have negotiated. He invaded Russia in 1708 and met disaster at Pava in 1709. The Swedish army was destroyed. Charles fled to Ottoman territory. Swedish power collapsed. By the time Charles died in 1718, killed by a bullet during a siege in Norway, the Swedish Empire was finished. Russia replaced Sweden as the dominant power in the Baltic. The Age of Greatness was over. Here's what fascinates me about this arc. Gustavus Adolphus created Swedish greatness. Charles I fallen destroyed it. Both were warrior kings, both led from the front. Both were brave to the point of foolishness. But Gustavus had something Charles lacked. Judgment. Gustavus knew when to fight and when to negotiate. He built alliances. He thought strategically. He created institutions that outlasted him. Charles just fought again and again until there was nothing left. In Sweden today, both kings are remembered, but Gustavus is revered. Charles is controversial, admired for his courage, criticized for his judgment. The difference is legacy. Gustavus left Sweden stronger than he found it. Charles left it broken. Historians love counterfactuals. What if Gustavus hadn't died at Loudoun? Some think he would have become Holy Roman Emperor. He was already treating German princes as subordinates. He was building a Protestant league under his leadership. The path to imperial power was open. Others think his ambitions would have overreached, that he would have made enemies of former allies, that his coalition would have fractured. We'll never know. What we do know is that his death at 37 cut short a trajectory that was pointing toward even greater things. Would he have made mistakes? Probably. Even geniuses make mistakes. But the 2 years he spent in Germany were enough to change military history forever. Imagine what he might have done with 20 more years. Modern Sweden is a small, peaceful, neutral country. It hasn't fought a war since 1814. It's known for social democracy, IKEA, and diplomatic neutrality. But the memory of Gustavus Adolphus remains. His statue stands in Stockholm. His face appears on pastries every November 6th. Schools teach his battles, and there's something poignant about that. A nation that once dominated Northern Europe, that produced one of history's greatest military commanders, is now famous for pacifism and furniture. Maybe that's a kind of wisdom. Maybe Sweden learned from the age of greatness and its collapse. That military power is fragile. That war eventually destroys those who wage it. Or maybe they just remember that once long ago, a Swedish king changed the world, and that's enough. Now, let's talk about why this matters beyond the 17th century. Because when military historians call Gustavus Adolphus the father of modern warfare, they're not just being poetic. His ideas are still with us right now in every modern army on Earth. Let me show you. The core of Gustavus' innovation was combined arms, making infantry, cavalry, and artillery work as a single integrated system. Each element covered the weaknesses. Of the others, infantry held ground. Cavalry delivered shock. Artillery provided fire support. No single arm had to win alone. Now look at a modern military operation. You have infantry advancing tanks providing armor and heavy firepower. Artillery laying down suppressive fire. Air support hitting targets beyond the range of ground weapons. Drones providing reconnaissance. Different tools, same concept. Every element supports every other element. No single arm operates alone. When you watch footage of modern combined arms operations, say a U.S. Marine advance or a Ukrainian assault on a fortified position, you're seeing Gustavus' philosophy translated into 21st century technology. He didn't invent tanks or helicopters, but he invented the idea that weapon systems should work together. That idea is immortal. The Tercio was rigid. It moved in one direction. It did one thing well. When situations changed, it couldn't adapt. Gustavus built an army that could adapt. Smaller units, faster decision-making. The ability to pivot, reinforce, exploit unexpected opportunities. Modern military doctrine obsesses over this. You hear? Terms like mission command. The idea that junior officers should have the authority to make decisions without waiting for orders from above. That commanders should give objectives, not specific instructions, so that forces can adapt at changing circumstances. You hear about UDA loops. Observe, orient, decide, act. The faster you cycle through this loop, the more you can outmaneuver an enemy who's still processing old information. All of this traces back to the same principle Gustavus understood. The army that adapts fastest wins. The Saxons broke at Breitenfield. The Swedes adapted. The Tercios couldn't. Gustavus won. For centuries later, the fastest adapting force still wins. Gustavus made cannons light enough to move during battle. Before him, artillery was positioned and basically stayed there. It was a stationary asset. After him, artillery became mobile. It advanced with infantry. It repositioned as the battle evolved. Now look at modern artillery. Self-propelled howitzers that can fire and move within minutes. Rocket artillery systems like HIMAR that strike and relocate before counter-battery fire can target them. The technology is unrecognizable, but the principle is pure Gustavus. Artillery that can move is more valuable than artillery that cannot. At Breitenfield, Gustavus held forces in reserve. This seems obvious now. Every military academy teaches it. You don't commit everything at once. You maintain a reserve to reinforce success, plug gaps, or exploit unexpected opportunities. But in Gustavus' time, this was not standard practice. Most commanders put their entire force into the initial formation. If something went wrong, there was nothing left. Gustavus understood that battles are chaotic, that plans fail, that you need options. His reserve saved his left flank when the Saxons broke. Without it, Breitenfield might have ended very differently. Modern armies take this even further. Strategic reserves, operational reserves, tactical reserves. Layers of forces held back at every level, ready to respond to the unexpected. It all comes from the same insight. No plan survives contact with the enemy. So, plan for that. Gustavus didn't just organize his army differently, he trained it obsessively. His soldiers drilled constantly. They practiced formations. They learned to reload faster. They rehearsed maneuvers until they could execute them in the chaos of battle. This emphasis on training was influenced by Maurice of Nassau, but Gustavus took it further, and it paid off at Breitenfield. When the Saxons broke, Swedish units pivoted in the middle of combat. That doesn't happen without training. That requires muscle memory, discipline, trust. Modern armies understand this completely. Special forces operators train for years before. They're considered ready. Even regular infantry spend months drilling before deployment. Exercises simulate combat conditions over and over. The philosophy is the same. In battle, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your training. Gustavus knew this 400 years ago when German forces invaded Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. They used a doctrine the world called blitzkrieg in a lightning war. What was blitzkrieg? Tanks punching through enemy lines at the point of maximum weakness. Aircraft providing close air support. Mechanized infantry following to secure gains. Everything moving fast. Everything coordinated. Does this sound familiar? It should. Blitzkrieg was Gustavian warfare translated into 20th century technology. Replace cavalry with tanks. Replace horse-drawn artillery with mobile field guns and aircraft. Replace pikemen with mechanized infantry. The principles are identical. Combined arms working together. Flexibility, speed, concentration of force, breakthrough, followed by exploitation. German military theorists had studied Gustavus extensively. They understood that the Tercio had failed because it was rigid. They saw the French defensive doctrine, the Maginot Line mentality, as a modern Tercio static, inflexible, waiting to be broken. And broken it was. In 6 weeks, France fell. The same France that had bled Germany for 4 years in World War I, the difference was doctrine. The difference was applying Gustavian principles with modern technology. Interestingly, World War I shows what happens when these principles are forgotten. From 1914 to 1918, armies on the Western Front became static. Trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, artillery that couldn't move forward fast enough to support advancing infantry. The result was slaughter. Battles like the Somme and Verdun killed hundreds of thousands of men for gains measured in yards. It was the opposite of everything Gustavus taught. There was no flexibility. Attacks followed rigid timets. They were no combined arms. Artillery and infantry couldn't coordinate in real time. There was no mobility. The front barely moved for years. Military historians often describe World War I as a regression, a return to something like Tercio warfare, mass and weight over maneuver and flexibility. The generals who broke the stalemate in 1918 did so by rediscovering Gustavian principles, infiltration tactics, combined arms using tanks, aircraft, and artillery together. Flexibility in command. The war ended not when one side ran out of men, but when one side figured out how to fight modern combined arms warfare again. In June 1967, Israel faced a coalition of Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, with larger armies and more equipment. Israel won in 6 days. How? Speed, surprise, combined arms, flexibility. The Israeli Air Force destroyed most of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in the first hours. Then, Israeli armored divisions, tanks, mechanized infantry, mobile artillery smashed through Egyptian lines in the Sinai. They didn't attack everywhere. They concentrated force at key points. They broke through, then exploited. They moved so fast that Egyptian commanders couldn't react. By the time Egypt understood what was happening, the battle was already lost. This is pure Gustavian warfare. The Arab armies had more men, more tanks, more artillery. But they fought rigidly according to pre-planned defensive positions. They were tercios waiting to be broken. The Israelis fought flexibly. Their junior commanders had authority to make decisions. Their different arms supported each other seamlessly. The result was one of the most lopsided victories in modern military history. When the United States and its coalition allies attacked Iraq in January 1991, they executed one of the most successful combined arms operations in history. First, air power. Coalition aircraft systematically destroyed Iraqi air defenses, command centers, supply lines, and forward units. For 5 weeks, Iraq was bombed continuously, then ground forces. The main Iraqi army was positioned in Kuwait and southern Iraq, expecting a frontal assault. Instead, coalition forces swung wide through the western desert. The famous left hook, armored divisions, mechanized infantry, mobile artillery, attack helicopters, all coordinated, all moving together. The Iraqi army collapsed in 100 hours of ground combat. Here's the Gustavian analysis. Iraq had a large army dug into defensive positions. Sound familiar? That's a tercio, a static fortress waiting to absorb an attack. The coalition didn't attack the fortress head-on. They used flexibility and mobility to hit it from an unexpected direction. They used combined arms to overwhelm it. They moved faster than Iraqi commanders could respond. General Norman Schwarzkopf, who commanded coalition forces, was a student of military history. He understood these principles. When asked about the campaign, he emphasized speed, shock, and combined arms. He could have been describing Breitenfield. Let me talk about something current. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, many expected a quick Russian victory. Russia had more tanks, more artillery, more aircraft, more soldiers. But the invasion stalled. Why? Partly because the Russian army, for all its size, struggled with combined arms coordination. Units didn't communicate well. Infantry and armor didn't support each other. Logistics collapsed. Meanwhile, Ukraine, with less equipment, fought flexibly. Small units with anti-tank missiles destroyed armored columns. Drones spotted targets for artillery. Forces adapted to circumstances rather than following rigid plans. This is the Gustavian lesson playing out in real time. Size matters less than coordination. Mass matters less than flexibility. Having more equipment means nothing if it can't work together. When Ukraine later launched counteroffensives, retaking Kyiv region in September 2022, for example, they applied combined arms principles effectively. Concentrated force at weak points, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, infantry, armor, and artillery coordinating. For centuries after Breitenfield, the same principles determined victory and defeat. Here's a modern development Gustavus would have appreciated. Drones, small, cheap, unmanned aircraft that can spot targets, drop munitions, and provide real-time intelligence. What's the historical parallel? Gustavus' mobile artillery. Before Gustavus' cannons were heavy and static. He made them light and mobile, able to move with advancing forces and provide fire support where needed. Drones do the same thing today. They provide firepower that moves with ground forces. They can reposition instantly. They give commanders real-time information about what's happening across the battlefield. A quadcopter drone carrying a grenade isn't physically similar to a 17th century field gun, but functionally they serve the same purpose. Mobile, flexible fire support. Military theorists are still working out exactly how drone warfare will evolve. But the underlying principle that mobile firepower beats static firepower is straight from Gustavus' playbook. Here's what strikes me. About all these examples, every generation seems to relearn Gustavian principles the hard way. World War I forgot them. Millions died in static slaughter until commanders rediscovered maneuver warfare. The French in 1940 forgot them. They built the Maginot Line and trusted in static defense. The Germans went around it. Russia in 2022 forgot them. They had mass. They lacked coordination. Their invasion stalled against a smaller but more flexible enemy. And every time someone applies these principles correctly, Germany in 1940, Israel in 1967, the coalition in 1991, the results are decisive. It's almost like there's a permanent tension in military thinking. On one side, the temptation of mass. More soldiers, more tanks, more guns. The Tercio instinct builds something so big it can't be beaten. On the other side, the Gustavian insight, flexibility, coordination, mobility, build something so adaptive it can't be pinned down. The Tercio instinct keeps coming back because it feels safe. Mass is visible. It's countable. Leaders can point to it and say, "Look how strong we are." The Gustavian approach is harder. It requires training, coordination, trust, junior leaders who can make decisions, systems that work together. But when the battle comes, Gustavus wins. He won at Breitenfield. His principles have been winning ever since. I want to end this section with a quote. Napoleon Bonaparte, now no slouch himself when it came to warfare, studied Gustavus extensively according to accounts of his conversations on St. Helena, Napoleon said. Gustavus Adolphus was the father of us all. Every innovation I employed, every principle I applied, I found first in his campaigns. He invented modern war. We have only refined it. It's coming from Napoleon. That's extraordinary. Here's a man who conquered most of Europe, saying that his own innovations were just refinements of what a Swedish king had figured out 170 years earlier. That's legacy. That's why the title matters. So let's return to where we started. Why does Gustavus Adolphus deserve that title? Not because he won battles. Many generals have won battles. Not because he conquered territory. Empires rise and fall. He deserves the title because he changed how humanity thinks about war. He looked at a system that had dominated for a century, the Tercio, and asked why it worked. Then he asked how it could be beaten. Then he built something better. He integrated cavalry, infantry, and artillery into a unified system where each element supported the others. He emphasized flexibility over rigidity, training over tradition, adaptation over repetition. He led from the front, inspiring loyalty that transformed ordinary soldiers into fanatics who would die before they retreated. And he proved it all on a field in Saxony when everything went wrong, and he still won. Breitenfeld wasn't just a battle. It was a proof of concept, demonstration that the old ways were dead and something new was possible, and the world has never been the same. The British military historian B.H. Littlehart described Gustavus' impact this way. Before Gustavus' armies were instruments of mass and weight. After Gustavus, they became instruments of speed and shock. He transformed warfare from a grinding contest of attrition into a dynamic art of maneuver. We are still fighting his kind of war. That phrase, still. Fighting his kind of war is the key. For centuries later, we're still fighting wars with his principles. Different weapons, different technologies, different enemies, same ideas, combined arms, flexibility, mobile firepower, trained professionals, leadership presence. When you see tanks and infantry advancing together with artillery support and drones overhead, that's Gustavus. When you see small units adapting to changing circumstances instead of following rigid orders, that's Gustavus. When you see a smaller force defeating a larger one through coordination and maneuver, that's Gustavus. His ghost is on every modern battlefield. He died at 37, shot from his horse in fog and chaos at Luton. he never saw Sweden become a great power. He never saw his daughter grow up. He never saw how completely his ideas would reshape the world. But maybe he knew in those letters where he calmly discussed the possibility of his death. Maybe he understood that what he was building would outlast him. The army, the tactics, the philosophy, these would survive. And they have. Gustavus Adolphus didn't just win the Battle of Breitenfield in 1631. He taught us how to fight. He changed what war itself meant. And that's why nearly 4 centuries later, we're still talking about him. That's why he's the father of modern warfare.